With that, let's look at the question, what is a job? And here's how we got to this point. Because we came to a conclusion at TIP some year or two ago when we realized something that some of you have heard me say before, and that is that business is not in the business of creating jobs. Now, that should come as a bit of a shock to you, because the fact that that is not their mission gets at the very heart of the incentive discussion, and it gets at the very heart of how we measure what we're doing. So I want to bring three perspectives into this. And we're already diverging from last year's Ignite presentation. The three perspectives are, what does the job world look like from the perspective of people, from the perspective of the firms that you think of as hiring them, and what does this mean from a policy perspective? So let's start with the people side of things. And the historical background to this is that before the Industrial Revolution, and bear with me here on the history side, before the Industrial Revolution, no one had a job. Everyone worked. They worked incredibly hard, but the idea of a job that they went to and punched in on was not part of their life. And this went all the way into these people didn't come in and punch a clock at the beginning of the day. What they produced, the value they added, was not what we traditionally think of as an employee relationship. Now, if you take that framework and you say to yourself, okay, let's step back, and what does it look like from the point of view of a firm? Suddenly the relationship becomes completely different. And what you're seeing here is a dynamic that played out, most notably, with the unions, in saying that a job was defined as a relationship between a corporation, the product of the Industrial Revolution, because before the Industrial Revolution there were no corporations. The whole idea of a corporation is new, and that's why the idea of a job is new. So the reaction of that relationship cut in a number of different ways, and the idea of protecting the worker was built into the model of this relationship. And that is really sort of the policy insight. And when you look at that history, still continuing to this day, but we've got labor unions now at a 97-year low. We're down to 11.3% and likely to decline further. So what I want to say about this is that we are witnessing the dissolution of a relationship that has traditionally defined a job. Now, I know this is a lot to absorb, and I know this isn't immediately clear to how this affects your profession, but we're going to get to that point. And really, we still use jobs, as I was saying, as a metric for economic growth. And we use this metric despite the fact that we haven't answered the question, whose job is it to create jobs? Because if it's not the private sector that has that responsibility, and it isn't the private sector's responsibility to do it, the private sector's responsibility is to return value to shareholders and to produce goods at a competitive cost. If you can do this, and I want to juxtapose these slides again because I love it. Kathleen in our office did this. When you look at this, and this is only your great-grandparents away, to this, and we'll have some charts to illustrate what that really means. Again, it is not the responsibility of those businesses. And so when you listen to Louise and you listen to the clawback, the discussion, you would be well advised, and I think we all would be, to take that step back and say, well, even if you want to claw back from the incentives you've given, are you fundamentally rewarding them for something that may not be in their interest? Are you with me on this? On the question. Not on whether you agree, but on the question. So that goes to the next question, the public sector question. Is it the public sector's responsibility to create jobs? Well, it has been. It has been. And the WPA is a wonderful example of that. However, we are not creating jobs in the sense of, the meaningful sense of, doing anything but using our own money to fund those that are not otherwise productive. In other words, we can't live on WPA projects. So maybe the better way to frame this question is, does a healthy economy require jobs? Is that necessary for an economy to be successful? And you may be surprised at the answer. And here's the graphic answer to your question. Now, these are two charts overlaid, so don't look for an intersection point. It's not here. These are just one chart showing civilian labor force participation from roughly 1990 to roughly the current date. And what you see is that that labor force participation reached its peak roughly at the point where what we think of as the IT revolution peaked in the early part of the last decade. At the same time, look at that same curve for real GDP per capita. So I think it's fair to conclude from this, and we have concluded from this, that participation in the labor force, and I think you'll hear some more about this from the other panelists, that civilian labor force participation rate is not going to be going up, but productivity will continue to go up. So let's take this to from a slightly different perspective, showing the same thing by the GDP to job gap index. So our GDP after the recession climbs on average here now still at 17%. But look at what's happened in terms of job creation and job growth. So the answer, the very uncomfortable answer for us is that indeed you can have a healthy economy without job creation. Now, is the conclusion of this that we will have an economy without jobs? No, that's not the conclusion. That's not the conclusion. But I think the fair conclusion is that anything that isn't moving toward an increase in manufacturing productivity, to use arguably the most important sector, if we're not doing those things that contribute to that manufacturing productivity, then we will also not have a good economy. But that increase in manufacturing productivity has in no instance since roughly 2000, and arguably before then, has it required new jobs to be created. So this is very important stuff. And if you don't like the way we framed the question, and you want to say, okay, let's not talk about whose job it is to create jobs. Let's talk about what are the conditions under which jobs are created. If that's the question that we want to ask, and I think that's a fair question, then we also re-enter the question of what kind of incentives are useful. And we answer probably an even more important question is, what does the composition of the workforce look like in a productive economy? Or, to put it differently, what are the conditions under which a value is created? So now I want to move to this sort of abstract discussion about whether healthy jobs or a healthy economy requires jobs, to this more fundamental question, what are the conditions under which value is created? And people without jobs still add value. And I think I'm queuing up the rest of the panel here, because the traditional relationship between a corporation and its hiring is the space in which we as economic developers have lived. That is exclusively the space in which we have lived. And we have fought, on the one hand, against those forces that would say, well, you know, cost structures have to be protected, and we realize that we offshore that, we can't do it. And so suddenly we're in this strange dynamic. And yet at the same time, the pressures from both the corporation to do more without jobs, and from the perspective of the, and now we're coming into a different realm, of the expectations of the workers, so-called, and their future, and the realization that, in the last data set, I think, showed that between the ages of 18 and 40, job change occurred, 11 job changes in that period of time. So we know, and when we give this presentation to a younger audience, they absolutely have no problem with this. Their expectation of a permanent relationship with a single corporate entity is not part of their mindset. They don't expect it, they don't want it, and I think that's part of the problems with the union notion of what, because the unions implicitly endorse the idea of a paternalistic relationship between themselves and their workforce. And now, with, I think, important changes in the Affordable Health Care Act, with Obamacare, saying that one of those critical factors, and we've, in our own research, have determined that, at least prior to the passage of that, or now the re-election of that, whether an entrepreneur started a business was in some way determined about whether they could get health care. Those were among the factors that mattered. Now that dynamic is changing, but the expectation of those individuals is still very different, and we need it to be different in our mindset as well. So let's take a look at what this means for your organization. So one thing it means is that, do you really understand the composition of your local or regional workforce? Now, you may say, yes, I do. I work with my Workforce Investment Board. But I want to argue, and I think I'll be supported in this, that you don't have that data. That in some measure, that data doesn't exist. And here's part of the problem, and it's really tied to the talent question and how you keep it and how you find it. So before we answer the question, let's take one more look at what the employer's expectation in this new economy is. At the height of the recession, the unemployment rate for college graduates in this country never broke 5%. At the height of the recession. However, the unemployment rate for those without four-year degrees never dropped very low. And I think the more impressive perspective on this is that the gap between education and unemployment is actually growing. In other words, the likelihood of you finding a job prior to 1990, if you didn't have a college degree, measured by your unemployment rate, was significantly lower than it is at any time after that. In other words, we have put a higher premium on education, and we continue to put that higher premium. So to the composition of the workforce question, who you serve as an EDC or an EDO defines the range of possibilities you have for participation in this new dynamic economy. So the first thing that you look at is your firms and payrolled employees. That's the data, those are the data sets that you have. But how well do you understand your freelancers, your 1099 economy? How good a grasp do you have on the role that they play, not just in terms of providing value directly, but in terms of their relationship to corporations? Now, one of the things that I think the rest of the panel will bring out, and we had in our conference call, was that little tidbit of information, and I don't have this as a data point, but for every new job created by an entrepreneurial firm, there are 4 to 5 outsourced jobs created by that firm. And that tendency of entrepreneurs to operate within a different environment from the traditional corporate structure is a really critical way for you to think about your own local regional economy and whether you can find those value-driven individuals within the 1099 economy, within the entrepreneurial economy, within freelancers, and yes, within the shadow economy. So if you're from the Texas-Mexico border, you know that we have an immense shadow economy there. A shadow economy that, and economists are willing to talk about, economic development never, which is that the most productive elements of the economy are literally black market. In Northern California, where you have unemployment rates in the northern counties of California, unemployment rates of 12, 14%, but you have unmeasured and dramatic job growth in sectors that aren't measured. So what I want to say is not to make a case for the black market, but I want to make a case in your minds for why you need to take a broader perspective of who's actually creating value within the economy. Who is it that is in these sectors that are not traditionally measured that you can tap into? And I want to say, by way of reinforcement of that notion, that you would not be at the vanguard of this. It is increasingly the view of your major corporations to answer that question first. They want to know not who is in the labor force measured by the traditional, because by and large, your unemployed will remain unemployable. This is a real shock to the economic development system. And to put it in a harsher tone, you cannot effectively do things that will lower your unemployment rate if the educational level of your unemployed remains low. So this is a policy perspective that is very hard, and I see Tom in the back of the room, and this is an issue for communities both dynamic and sluggish. It's an issue in Las Vegas, where you have a large percent of the labor force whose transition into a technology economy cannot occur unless the educational attainment of those unemployed goes up. And I would say that that is not unique just to economies like Las Vegas. It's true of economies like Vancouver, Washington, where we're working. It's true in Austin, Texas. And it's true in the upper Midwest. It's true, in effect, everywhere where our expectations of what the productivity of our workforce should be based on an old model of who is hired. So we really have to ask ourselves a different kind of question. We need to ask ourselves the question, which projects that we are engaged in are going to be of the most value, and the incentives and the support that we give to those projects, I would argue, will no longer be measured by job creation. Because it is not in job creation that the value of a project should be determined. And that would be a radical shift from the way that we have thought about this in the past. And I've probably run past my time, and I'll save space at the end for others and for Q&A. So thank you very much.